We would expect that the Americans would reciprocate and they would question officials, including the officers of law enforcement and intelligence services of the United States, whom we believe who have something to do with illegal actions on the territory of Russia.
What he did is an incredible offer. He offered to have the people working on the case come and work with their investigators with respect to the 12 people. I think that's an incredible offer.
Russian authorities yesterday named several Americans who they want to question, who they claim were involved in Bill Browder's quote-unquote crimes in their terms, including a former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Does President Trump support that idea? Is he open to having U.S. officials questioned Russia?
The president's going to meet with his team, and we'll let you know when we have an announcement on that.
For a second, is that a topic that came up in their conversation? Did President Putin raise this with President Trump?
There was some conversation about it, but there wasn't a commitment made on behalf of the United States, and the president will work with his team, and we'll let you know if there's an announcement on that front.
That was the White House briefing room yesterday. Joining us now, professor of political science and director of the Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Michael also is an NBC News international affairs analyst. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us this morning, up early on the West Coast for us. Just as a human being, what was it like for you to watch the president call that offer, given that you are probably a part of that offer, an incredible one, and then to see the White House yesterday say, yeah, we're talking about it, we're discussing it, we haven't made any commitment?
Well, I was in Helsinki live working with you guys, by the way, when they first discussed that. And they didn't mention my name in Helsinki, but they did mention Mr. Browder's name. I was shocked by that. And then I think people need to understand, they said these 11 individuals who they think were involved in the so-called Browder scheme of money laundering, right? These government officials, that's what Putin said. It later then came out in the Russian press that they had a list, and I was at the top of that list. Shocking. This is classic whataboutism by the Russians, right? You have this indictment, well, we have this indictment of these people, tit for tat. And then most shocking and just lamentable, I think, is my real reaction when the White House was given the opportunity to categorically reject this moral equivalency between a legitimate indictment with lots of data and evidence to support it from Mr. Mueller with a crazy cockamamie scheme with no relationship to facts and reality whatsoever. The White House refused to do that. And I hope they get, I hope somebody asks them another question today and they'll get it right today. We've seen a lot of that lately, that they want to have a take 2 and take 3 to get the message right. But this is not just about me. This is about American national interests. We cannot allow this kind of moral equivalency when dealing with Vladimir Putin.
We played the White House reaction to that question yesterday. Let me show you a different story at the State Department yesterday. Here's that exchange.
I can't answer on behalf of the White House with regard to that, but what I can tell you is that the overall assertions that have come out of the Russian government are absolutely absurd. The fact that they want to question 11 American citizens and the assertions that the Russian government is making about those American citizens, we do not stand by those assertions that the Russian government makes.
And Ambassador, that seemed to be the consensus inside the halls of Congress. You had Republicans and Democrats alike saying this is not going to happen. Senator Mark Warner said we're not sending Ambassador McFaul to Russia. Do you think there's any chance this actually happens?
Well, first of all, I want to thank my State Department colleagues for that very strong statement. What was unusual about it, I mean, it was fantastic. That's like what a normal statement would be in normal times. Yeah. The thing that was abnormal about it was the first phrase. While I can't speak for the White House, I'm sorry, this is one Trump administration. I worked at the White House for 3 years. That sentence, if it ever had come up, both sides would be outraged. Right. The White House would say, what do you mean? You don't speak for us, and vice versa. So yet again, the Trump administration seems to have two policies towards Russia, not one. With respect to the future, I now have lawyers and I have to take precautions. I think it's highly unlikely that the U.S. government would ever entertain it's called an MLAT request. There is a treaty where this can happen with respect to criminal investigations. but the Department of Justice would have to approve of it, and then I also would be able to go to a judge if that happened, but I think that's a pretty low probability.
Hi, Ambassador. You are a former ambassador. You're a scholar. You understand Russian psyops. You understand their geopolitical strategy and goals. What do you think Vladimir Putin tried to do to Trump in that meeting? What do you think he might have tried to get out of him in that meeting? And secondly, what would they do to you? If we did send you over there, what would Putin do to you?
Well, it's a classic. I've known Vladimir Putin for a long time. Met him first in 1991. I've been in several meetings with him when I was in the government. And I wrote a whole book about his intimidation and harassment of me as the U.S. ambassador to try to document for the American people who this guy is and what he does, both abroad and to his own people and to diplomats like me. It's unprecedented what he does. With his meeting with Trump, it's classic whataboutism. You got your problems, we got our problems, you have your charges, we have our charges against your American government officials. And what I fear, because President Trump probably is not as conversant in these issues as he should be, or most certainly not as conversant as Putin is he probably just nodded along and said, oh, yeah, okay, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Oh, you have some trouble with our government officials? Oh, well, and you don't need to believe me. He said it to the world. You played the clip. He thinks it was a really great idea. And that's just perfect for Vladimir Putin. With respect to me personally, Vladimir Putin doesn't like me. He doesn't like what I've written about him. He doesn't like what I say about him right now, not even when I was in the government. This is an act of intimidation against me, and it's going to create problems for me in the long run. My government, I hope, will step up today and categorically swat this back. And when I mean my government, I mean my President of the United States of America. When he just said last night, America is no longer under attack, I'm sorry. I'm an American, and I'm under attack by Vladimir Putin right now, so I hope he'll stand up. But now they're going to make my life more difficult as I travel abroad, perhaps, with Interpol, perhaps. They want to harass me, and they want to intimidate me and make me quiet.
Mr. Ambassador, congrats, I guess, for waking up on American soil. Question for you about the chilling effect that this might have on the diplomatic corps. We talked to a few diplomats about this yesterday, and I would safely say that they were aghast by what they heard. There are diplomats in the field right now, people in Russia, as they look at the potential that the current president may trade in a former diplomat. What does it mean for the work they do, and what kind of effect might it have on our geopolitical relations as they currently are constituted?
That's a great question, and I've heard from a lot of diplomats as well, and former diplomats over the last 24 hours. It is chilling. The notion that our president just kind of very casually said, oh, yeah, let's have our diplomats be interrogated. I want to be clear, to be interrogated because they think we're criminals. Vladimir Putin was very clear about that, and subsequently his law enforcement officials have been very clear about that. And it's scary. Diplomats are supposed to have diplomatic immunity, and to now be, have to worry about this, and just, it's the image of America. We look weak. We look like we won't push back on outrageous, crazy ideas. That is not even good for President Trump. I hope if you guys are listening, you look weak in the eyes of Vladimir Putin. You cannot believe the kinds of cartoons that are circulating in the Russian press right now. It's time to push back on President Putin, and not just when you're sitting at home, but when you're standing right next to him. Because if you don't, we're going to be dealing with this guy pushing us around the world and harassing our diplomats inside Russia for a long, long time.
Ambassador McFaul, Elise Jordan here. I don't know if you've had a chance to see who some of your fellow travelers are on Putin's list of 11 Americans that he would like to question. But if you have, is there any common strain that led Vladimir Putin to deem these Americans of interest? And why is it that these specific individuals have angered him?
So that's a great question, and I don't have a complete answer. I haven't had time to think about it. I mean, some of the names on that list are people I know well. David Kramer, for instance, he's a former assistant secretary to the Bush administration, and he was a vocal supporter of the Magnitsky Act that President Obama signed in 2012, that Bill Browder was a champion for. And that Magnitsky Act basically says the United States has the right to deny travel to people suspected of human rights abuses, including the tragic death of Sergei Magnitsky, a lawyer hired by Bill Browder to represent him in Russia. He died in pretrial detention. So people like David, I think we're affiliated with that. A few others, some congressional people. Then there's a couple others that I think may be affiliated with the Steele dossier, to the best of my reading of the tea leaves. Another dossier that the Russians don't like.
Ambassador McFaul is somebody who, as you said, has known Putin for almost 30 years and understands the way he thinks. What does Vladimir Putin hear when he sees the President of the United States questioning the NATO alliance, when he makes those comments he made about Montenegro? Why should we go out and defend? What does Putin hear when the President says those things?
I think he's as shocked as the rest of us. Never in his wildest dreams, when he intervened in 2016 to try to help candidate Trump win that election, did he think that just 2 years later, the President of the United States would be questioning our Article 5 commitments? It's just, I mean, it's beyond, I can't imagine that back in 2016 that they ever thought they would be in this place. It's an extremely dangerous thing that the President said. I hope, again, his team around him will convince him to walk it back like we have to walk back so many things. But it just sends a dangerous signal, because the uncertainty about our commitment to NATO undermines the whole purpose of NATO. It undermines deterrence. You have to have rock-solid commitment and unity. Otherwise, the whole idea of the NATO alliance for deterring Russia doesn't work.
Ambassador Michael McFaul, we always appreciate you being on, especially this morning with the eyes of the world on you, explaining your side of this. Thank you so much. We want to mention Ambassador's new book, From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia, a must-read in these times. Still ahead.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.